That morning, the sky was cloudier than the minds of those who think they can run everything with a laminated paper badge. My 16-year-old son had just left the house to pick up his mail. That was it. Sweatshirt, headphones, sleepy face, and that dragging gait, typical of someone who woke up against their will. It was Sunday. The street was empty, except for the birds, a random cat, and her. The woman was in front of the association's headquarters, holding her usual clipboard, surrounded by two figures who looked like they'd just stepped out of a shopping center security training session. Tactical vests, toy walkie-talkies, and an expression of someone who takes the title of community order agent very seriously. The three of them stared at my son as if he were a suspected international terrorist. It's important to understand the context. We live in a neighborhood of people who think security is done with lawn mowers and motivational pamphlets. The HOA here has an ego bigger than the city and less power than a broken fence. But nobody told this woman that. She sees herself as the supreme commander of suburbanized peace. And that day, she thought my son, with his baggy sweatshirt and zero desire to socialize, was a threat to the visual and spiritual order of the neighborhood. As he bent down to pick up a mailbox, she approached with the two policemen in tow. One of them reached into his pocket, where he probably kept a flashlight and a whistle. The other pulled out a notebook on which he was probably writing imaginary fines. The approach was immediate. They surrounded the boy as if he was trying to break into the Capitol, but he just wanted to see if the sneakers he had ordered had arrived. "Identify yourself immediately," said one of the men, with the intonation of someone who had memorized the phrase by watching a Netflix crime series. My son took a headset out of his ear, without understanding anything, and replied, "Huh? That was enough." The woman then, at the height of her delirium of authority, pointed her finger and shouted, "Stranger in a residential area! Get him away from the perimeter!" The two of them looked at each other for a second, as if thinking, "Is this serious?" but followed the order like good soldiers in a war that only existed in her head. They pulled my son by the arm. That's right, they dragged him down the sidewalk, ignoring his protests, his astonishment and the fact that the house he came out of was clearly his. The boy kept trying to argue, saying that he lived there, that he was just picking up a package, but nobody listened, or rather, nobody wanted to listen. For them, it was more important to maintain the aesthetic security of the neighborhood than to use two neurons and understand the situation. I was in the kitchen, making coffee. The first thing I noticed was the sound of hurried footsteps on the sidewalk, then excited voices. I opened the window and saw the scene. My son being escorted by two B-movie extras and a wide-eyed woman, as if she had unmasked the villain from the 8 o'clock soap opera. I left on the spot. I ran down the stairs so fast that I left the coffee maker on. When I got to the gate, she was already saying something about security intervention and maintaining residential order. One of the agents was trying to put the boy on a bench in the neighborhood square as if it were a makeshift cell. My son, clearly shocked, just kept repeating, "Are you crazy? I live over there." The whole scene was a living absurdity, the kind of thing that, if someone describes in a WhatsApp group, you think it's fake. But there it was, my son being taken away from home by a bunch of people who thought it was a crime to wear a sweatshirt and not smile early in the morning. When I arrived, the first thing I did was look straight at her face. She already knew me. We'd had our clashes, all involving absurd rules and unnecessary notifications. But at that moment, she didn't recognize me. Or maybe she thought that even if she did, she was still right, because when arrogance enters, logic leaves. This young man was approached for suspicious conduct. He refused to identify himself and seemed to be spying on the houses in the street, she said, full of herself. One of the men next to her tried to look serious and added, "We're just ensuring the integrity of the community, ma'am." I didn't reply immediately. I took my cell phone out of my pocket, opened the gallery, and showed the photo of our family, me, my husband, and our son, taken exactly in front of the house from which he was forcibly removed. They looked. The man with the notebook stuttered. The woman tried to change her tune, but he didn't look like a resident. He was strange. He didn't say hello to anyone. I took a deep breath. My blood was already boiling, but I didn't even have to raise my voice. I just asked one question. "Do you know who he is?" She hesitated. She looked at the boy, then at me. Then, as if it were possible to remedy the unforgivable, she let out a, "Well, we didn't know he was." He didn't even have to finish. In that street, everyone knew who his father was. And what happened next was just the beginning of what was to come. The news got out faster than gate gossip. It only took 20 minutes and half the neighborhood already knew that the police chief's son had been dragged from his home by 2 HOA volunteers with a mania for stalking and a woman who thought the neighborhood was a barracks. That same afternoon, my garage turned into a desperate disinformation center. The phone wouldn't stop. People calling to say they were just following protocol, that they didn't know the boy was a family member, that it was all a misunderstanding, that classic festival of excuses that only appears when the ground begins to collapse beneath the feet of those who abused the little power they thought they had. She didn't show up. She disappeared, as if she could evade responsibility just because she didn't want to face reality. But the 2 agents from the community patrol came shyly, wearing caps, soccer jerseys, no vests, no walkie-talkies. Now they were just ordinary neighbors pretending that they never meddled in anyone's life. One of them came with the same energy as someone who apologizes for accidentally knocking over a shopping trolley in the supermarket. He said he thought the boy was lost and that the dark sweatshirt confused him. Dark sweatshirt. That became the legal basis for the impromptu arrest. The other just nodded, silent, as if he already knew that any word could be used against him. And it would be. Meanwhile, at the police station, the case was already in the hands of those who knew what to do. The video from the house cameras was analyzed. The violent approach, the attempt to force the boy off the sidewalk, the cries of mandatory cooperation recorded by a neighbor filming from afar, all documented, all printed. The irony? The community patrol had officially become the target of a criminal investigation. The HOA tried to disassociate itself. It said that the 2 had acted without formal authorization, that they did not officially represent the association, even though a few days earlier they had been on the cover of the monthly newsletter as defenders of residential harmony. They deleted the post, they disappeared with the files, but the neighborhood saw and remembered. My son, despite his fright, held on well, more because of his surname than his age. But the emotional damage was not small. He was pulled out of his own yard, like a criminal, in front of everyone. Friends saw it, neighbors saw it, teachers heard about it. Even with all the positive reaction afterwards, the apologies, the promises of "we'll get better," the trauma doesn't go away like that. On the other side of town, a local radio station began to comment on the case in a sensationalist tone. They used the headline, "Police Chief's Son is Victim of HOA Patrol. Will Justice Be Done?" And the program bombed. People called in with similar stories. Cases of neighbors being embarrassed, warned for hanging towels on the balcony, for watering plants at a time not in keeping with the collective spirit. Things exploded. She, of course, couldn't take the pressure. She showed up a few days later at a hastily called meeting. She went there with the same posture as always. Straight shoulders, high heels, impeccable clothes, face trained to hold expressions. But something had changed in her. It was no longer firmness. It was a restrained nervousness, like someone who enters an environment and feels the weight of being alone. She said, into the microphone in the association room, that she deeply regretted what had happened, and that she had no intention of causing any embarrassment to the family involved. The words were rehearsed, millimetrically calculated, but the audience, neighbors tired of years of absurdities, didn't applaud. They didn't react. They just watched. One resident stood up and asked if she planned to resign. She didn't say anything. She said she was reflecting. Another resident said he was afraid to leave his children in the yard after what happened. She replied that the safety of the neighborhood has always been her priority. That's when someone in the background whispered, "Except when it's someone's kid who can arrest you, right?" She heard. Everyone heard. Over the next few days, new accusations emerged, old stories that had never come to light because of fear, people who had been approached at the gate, coerced into cutting back the weeds in the garden, forbidden to hang clothes out on the line. The same two agents were involved, and all the orders, according to reports, came from her. An investigation was launched. The city council got in on the act, and it went from being a neighborhood joke to an official scandal. The association was temporarily suspended, positions were frozen, and the woman, well, she finally understood that no clipboard in the world can erase the name of the person you've decided to confront. The police chief's son. The scandal over the boy's arrest had already become the talk of the entire county. It was no longer just some neighborhood bullshit. It was a small headline in the local newspaper, a debate on community radio, and a cause for alarm in groups of lawyers who monitored abuses in residential areas. The HOA, which until then had sold itself as a model organization, was now associated with shame and ridiculous authoritarianism. The irony of it all was that, for so long, it had preached the word of visual order and appropriate behavior, as if it were a missionary of social aesthetics. Only now her image was glued to memes, GIFs, and leaked audios that traveled around the neighborhood WhatsApp group with the same speed as a rotten plumbing leak. In front of her house, the once meticulously cut plants began to show signs of neglect. The lawn no longer had that perfect line like a school ruler. The ceramic pots that used to shine with so much varnish were now dull. She had even lost control of her own garden. And that, for someone like her, hurt more than losing any job. The headquarters of the HOA, which was located in the old function room of the community club, was closed. A padlock, yellow tape, a piece of paper from the town hall stuck to the door with the words, "Temporarily closed to investigate administrative irregularities." An official notice, no emojis, no slogan, no graphic art. The stark reality. Some of the older residents, previously defenders of the association's order, began to speak out. One lady, who had already served coffee at 5 assemblies in a row, commented loudly at the fair, "These people have confused the garden with the barracks." Another ex-military man said that even he didn't like being patrolled so much. Little by little, idolatry turned into detachment. Her base dissolved, like bad quality paper in the rain. She tried to defend herself. She sent an email, as usual, long, confusing, with words like community mismatch, misinterpreted intention, and conflict of civil expectations. Only now no one would read it, nor did they reply. People simply deleted it, marked it as spam, or made jokes. Another chapter in the HOA soap opera has arrived. The city council, pressured by the public uproar, scheduled a preliminary hearing, and the call was official. It had a time, date, place, and protocol. This time there was no room for rehearsed speeches or lavender-scented excuses. It was her, face-to-face with real justice and a pile of complaints waiting to be read out. On the day of the hearing, she appeared alone. No exaggerated makeup, no starched blazer, no colored papers that she always brought to show graphics that nobody asked for. She looked haggard, but still tried to hold her pose. She sat in the room with her back straight, as if that would disguise the fact that she was shrinking inside. The session was tough. Residents gave testimonies. One father recounted how his 14-year-old daughter was reprimanded for spending too much time on the sidewalk looking at her cell phone. Another reported that he was warned for leaving his car with the trunk open while he unloaded groceries. The highlight was the testimony of a mother who cried when she told how her son was called a disruptive presence for running around in a rock band t-shirt. But the most awaited moment was that of the family involved in the situation that set everything off. The boy calmly and firmly recounted every detail: the approach, the push, the insults disguised as authority, the fear. He said he didn't even have time to understand what was going on before he was treated like a trespasser in his own backyard. The municipal prosecutor listened to everything with a pen in his hand and an expression that mixed boredom with restrained indignation. When he had finished, he simply asked, "Do you have anything to say about the conduct of the two men who acted under your direct guidance?" The woman hesitated. She looked around. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. In the end, she only managed to say, "It was an error of judgment. I didn't mean to." The prosecutor replied coldly, "Unfortunately, you turned a neighborhood organization into a platform for personal control. And that has consequences." The investigation went to the public prosecutor's office. The HOA was officially dissolved, and a new model of community management began to be studied with direct mediation from the city council. No resident accepted the proposal that she continue in any representative capacity. It was unanimous. The following week, her house was covered with a tarpaulin. Some said she was going to paint it. Others thought it was to escape embarrassment. The gate remained closed. The car had been idle for days. A strange silence surrounded the address, as if she had become a ghost of what she had once tried to be. But nothing struck a deeper chord than the new billboard discreetly placed in the neighborhood's central square. It had no name, no signature, just a simple phrase. "This is not a barracks. This is home." In the fourth week after the scandal, the neighborhood breathed like someone coming out of a stuffy sauna into an open field. It was as if an invisible pressure had finally been released. The residents were beginning to recognize each other again, but now with a different look. There was no longer an atmosphere of surveillance. No one was afraid to go out and sweep the sidewalk outside of community hours. People were finally relaxing. Even the neighbor's dog, which used to be silenced with anonymous letters, started barking again as if it had something to celebrate. Her house was still covered in tarpaulin. It was as if she had become a walking renovation. She left early, with her head down, came back later, and nobody knew exactly what she was doing. The woman who had once prided herself on running assemblies, handing out regulations with hand-drawn hearts, and keeping everything under the yoke of visual harmony, now went unnoticed. Worse than being hated was being ignored, and she knew it. The community meetings were back, but this time without a microphone, without a compulsory attendance list, without a timed schedule. The chairs were arranged in a circle. Everyone could speak. Even the children had a say. It was strange at first, because the neighborhood was used to military order, but it became natural. The community rediscovered itself in the mess. A good, human, possible mess. The boy, the involuntary center of all the confusion, went back to his routine as if nothing had happened, but with a certain different respect. People now waved to him in the street. The old people who used to complain about the volume of his headphones now asked him what he was listening to. Even the art teacher at school asked him to tell her in class what it was like to be mistakenly arrested by a lady with a sheriff's complex. He didn't want to say much. He just said that the strangest thing was being treated like a thug just for existing in silence. The sentence hit, and it got around. Several teenagers started repeating it as a motto. One of them made a t-shirt with the phrase printed on it. He sold it at the neighborhood fair. The proceeds were used to buy new benches in the square, where people could now sit without fear of looking too inactive. It was in this same square that, one afternoon, someone hung up a mural with anonymous stories from residents telling of minor abuses suffered by the former HOA management. Short stories like, "I got a ticket for hanging up colorful clothes. I was warned for smiling loudly. I was asked to paint the wall because the shade of white wasn't the same as the neighbors." Small acts of violence that, taken together, paint a picture of control disguised as an organized neighborhood. The woman didn't respond publicly to any of this, but, according to reports, she tried to talk to some of her former allies. She wanted to come back, discreetly, just helping out on the side. The answer was always the same: silence or a little smile at the corner of the mouth. The kind of smile that doesn't open any doors. She continued to live there, and the truth is that nobody wanted to kick her out, not because they liked her, but because the neighborhood had learned its lesson. Kicking her out was what she would do. The neighborhood preferred to let her stay, but outside the decisions. A kind of exile that doesn't need walls. A while later, the two agents of the former community patrol sent messages to the boy's family apologizing. Not in public, in private. They were simple messages, with sincere words and no attempt to justify the unjustifiable. The family replied that they accepted, but that they wouldn't forget. At the New Year's Eve party, the first without a committee, without a pamphlet, without control over who could bring what, the neighborhood came together like never before. Everyone brought what they wanted. They set up makeshift tables, hung lights on poles, played music on a cell phone connected to an old speaker. Everything was disorganized, unstandardized, and perfect. The boy was there, with his friends, laughing, talking loudly, wearing dark sweatshirts, with his headphones hanging around his neck, and no one to tell him it was suspicious. She showed up too, alone. She passed by, looked from a distance, stood still for a few seconds. No one came up to her, but nobody chased her away either. She watched for a while, like someone who finally understood that she was no longer the protagonist of that story. Just another extra in the episode she herself had created. At the end of the evening, when everyone was leaving, an older woman, the same one who had defended everything she did, but who had kept quiet in recent weeks, passed by and just said, "You see, we didn't need so much control, just respect." The woman didn't reply. The following week, she removed the tarpaulin from the house. She cut down the weeds. She cleaned the sidewalk. But she didn't reinstall any signs, nor did she email again. And for the first time since it all began, her street actually looked nice. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave a comment and a like.